The 1920s was a pivotal decade in the history of the United States because it was a time when wealth and prosperity was on the forefront of everyone's mind because the average person finally had the means to indulge in luxurious items and activities. The 1920s was shaped by the earlier progressive era during the 1910s, marking a revolutionary time in which reform of social and economic policies were accepted and prevalent. One of the main topics of discussion in this time period was labor reforms. For decades, the working conditions in factories and mills were extremely unfavorable to laborers due to the fact that they had long hours and little pay. As a result, labor unions began to strike for their rights. Sometimes these strikes were successful, while other times they simply did not help the situation. This was evident by the events at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in Manhattan. In 1911, 145 female workers were killed because they were locked in the factory, effectively making them unable to escape the fire that was engulfing the building. This started a major reform movement among the workers. They were angry and willing to put up a fight. In addition to efforts in this department, journalists known as muckrakers attempted to expose the ills of big companies. For example, Upton Sinclair's novel The Jungle, originally published in 1906, exposed the problems of the meat packing industry. Many other novels and articles seem to flood the reading material of the early 1900s as well. The end of World War I in 1919 was a turning point in women's role in society. Due to the fact that women took over women's jobs while they were away at war, they wanted to continue their place in the public sphere even after the men returned from overseas. The many events and ideas that filled the early 1900s set the stage for the 1920s. The Roaring Twenties was a time of social change. This can be seen through the emergence of the New Woman. The New Woman consisted of women who exercised their power of voting and broke through the change of the cult of domesticity. Throughout time, women were always seen as the inferior sex and restricted to the expectations imposed on their gender by society, which mainly consisted of maintaining the home. As the 1920s progressed, women began to strike for the same social, economic, and political equality as men. In addition, 1920 was a major moment for women with the passage of the 19th Amendment, which granted all women the right to vote. The 19th Amendment foreshadowed the great change for the role of women in society since women's confidence only continued to grow. Furthermore, flappers gave the woman a new identity. Flappers broke the stereotype of women being very conservative as they dominated the social scene and were very open about their sexuality and took advantage of the consumer society of the 1920s. The Roaring Twenties society continued to help women break stereotypes of being a domestic woman since they were forcing the idea of independence. Women were now able to make their own choices on their careers, education, jobs, and marital status. The new woman ultimately broadened the woman's role in political and social life as well as life at home.
The positive social changes did not stop with the emergence of the New Woman, as it continued to spread when African Americans found a new place in society. The Harlem Renaissance, as it came to be known, was when Harlem, a district in New York, exploded during this time period. Many black artists, musicians, writers, poets, and scholars filled this area and spread their creativity with the rest of New York. This movement, dubbed the term the New Negro, in which blacks were becoming proud of their race and finally gained a voice to stop their oppression and segregation from the rest of society. When African Americans were essentially creating their own identity, which marked a major turning point in the black culture and their place in the domestic sphere of the United States. Crucial to this movement were magazines such as The Crisis, which was published by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. This magazine was founded by W.E.B. Du Bois with the hopes of advertising the black culture as well as their struggles and triumphs. Another example of works of art during this time period include Palmer C. Hayden's Jeunesse, which displayed well-educated African Americans that were dancing and making music. Furthermore, Archibald J. Motley was another popular Harlem Renaissance artist whose 1929 painting, Blues, showed African Americans enjoying themselves through song and dance. These depictions of African Americans appreciating culture was partly an attempt to break down stereotypes of African Americans as less than refined. The Harlem Renaissance was not isolated to the region of Harlem, as it spread to other areas in the city and across the East Coast. Overall, this new emergence of black culture spread positive sentiment throughout the country among African Americans. However, it did not last forever. Another reason, and perhaps the most important reason this time period was called the Roaring Twenties, was due to the success of the new consumer culture. The United States was focused on mass producing luxuries the public desired. During the 1920s, many middle class workers were paid decently, allowing them to have extra money to spend on themselves. Also, the elite classes were able to spend their money on anything they wanted and demanded more luxury items were created. America began its transition into a capitalist nation. The creation of new materials and luxuries was a positive during the 20s. New inventions made housework, jobs, and other activities much more fun and easy. For example, the vacuum cleaner, electric refrigerator, washing machines, and irons were successful inventions making housework quicker. The middle class also benefited from the consumer revolution since the influx of new luxuries allowed the economy to make prices of certain luxuries affordable. Buy now, pay later was a popular slogan and lifestyle during this period. However, the mantra inevitably led to the Great Depression. One reason the Great Depression occurred was due to too many people paying in credit and could not pay the banks back. Despite this unfortunate result, the 1920s was still a time of prosper and wealth. The consumer society began through the creation of the automobile, particularly Ford's Model T and Model A cars. This new form of transportation was extremely well known and desired by many. Ford's company perfected the assembly line process, speeding up production and allowing automobiles to meet the demands of the public. Soon, many companies adopted Ford's technique of production, enabling other companies to create and sell their products. Advertising was another component as to why the consumer society succeeded so quickly. Billboards, posters, and commercials, shows on TV, created in 1925, strengthened the consumer society since these new fashionable and colorful lights encouraged consumers to go out and spend their money. For example, the Coca-Cola Company continues succeeding in creating advertisement which persuade customers that their product is fun and needed. Way companies attracted attention to their services included radio broadcasts. It was not uncommon to use the radio as means of spreading the word about a specific company or product. Furthermore, tobacco became popular during this decade and three major companies battled it out to become the top seller: Camel, Lucky Strike, and Chesterfield. These companies persuaded buyers to purchase their product by claiming it would make them cool and illustrated that they had money. Overall, the 1920s was a revolutionary period since the consumer society created a new luxurious American culture for both the wealthy and the middle class citizens. Despite the fact that groups at the top of the social ladder were excelling financially, lower class civilians and minority groups struggled to afford everyday necessities.
Although the 1920s presented itself with luxury and prosper, this time period was ultimately filled with deep-rooted problems in industry and society that affected the citizens of the 20th century United States. Behind the affluence of the 1920s, there were many social problems that went unnoticed, and an example of this was the reemergence of the Ku Klux Klan. White Protestant nativists sought to maintain the original goals of the KKK that existed in the 1970s, which was reestablished of white supremacy. The reemergence of the KKK increased their targets from the African Americans to Jews, Catholics, and members of the organized labor, as well due to their fear of communism, which increased anti-immigration sentiment. By the 1920s, the KKK membership exceeded 4 million, and in 1924, the Klan controlled half of the state legislators. The KKK advocated against the increasing industrial society, which contained corrupt businesses such as bootlegging, filmmaking, and big business. Klan members despised the wealthy and elite as they believed them to be the cause of the fall of their precious agricultural society. Much of the Klan activity consisted of burning crosses and impending violence upon minority groups, such as whippings, tarrings, and feathering, and even lynching. The reemergence of the KKK represents one of the major social issues of the 1920s. Furthermore, the 1920s represented a time of social resentment towards immigrants. Many Americans believed that the immigrants were coming in high numbers and were stealing the jobs of Americans. Thus, they began enforcing immigration restrictions upon the vulnerable newcomers. Between the 1880s and 1920, more than 25 million immigrants came to the United States, most of them coming from Southern and Eastern Europe.
labeled as new immigrants. The majority of these immigrants were young males who intended to make money and then return to their native countries. This caused for more competition in obtaining jobs, which ultimately increased anti-immigration. This led to the implementation of the National Origins Act of 1921 and 1924. The act limited the number of immigrants entering the United States through a national origins quota. This quota allotted visas to 2% of the total nationality already in the United States as of the 1890 census. The act also completely banned immigration from Asian countries. The enforcement of these acts created a division among the country and contributed to the social tensions of the time period.
Despite the guise of the 1920s being a time of prosperity due to the success of the stock market, only the top 5% of Americans actually lived luxurious lives, while the rest of the population suffered from poverty. While those who participated in the stock market benefited economically, the rest of the public drowned in debt. Poverty emerged during the 1920s because of the declining number of farms. The conclusion of World War I helped Europe to reestablish their agricultural base, and grain from Australia and Argentina entered the global market. As a result, the foreign countries no longer relied on America for agricultural needs. The situation of farmers only darkened since farmers could not pay off their high debts or taxes and could not afford to maintain their farmland. The failure of the agricultural market not only affected the livelihood of farmers, but the banking system had increasing pressure as well. Since farmers were not able to pay off their debts, banks began falling since they could no longer secure loans to the impoverished population, leading to bankruptcy. Different races also experienced maldistribution of wealth in the 1920s. The top 5% of the Americans who prospered during this period were white men and women. At first, farmers and other workers hoped that the ultra-rich would invest in their companies, but the affluent continued to spend their money only on luxuries. Similarly to the majority of lower-class American families, Native Americans and Mexicans also suffered economically. Most of these families could not afford food for themselves and their family, and it was noted that some families lived only on $200 a year. The economic class difference continued to grow through the 1920s. Everything went to ruin after the stock market crashed. In 1929 to 1933, the government tried to alleviate the economic tension America was facing since everyone was now suffering due to the market crash. The Federal Reserve Act was put into action with the intended purpose of curbing stock market speculation. However, the Federal Reserve ended up slowing the growth of money supply and enabled the money supply to fall quickly around the market crash, resulting in a liquidity crisis. The Roaring Twenties came to an end after the crash of the stock market, and there was no longer a maldistribution of wealth, since the Great Depression slowly took over the lives of Americans.
The 1920s was a pivotal decade in the history of the United States due to the fact that the truth of this time period was hidden beneath the wealth and prosper of the upper and middle classes. It was similar to the Golden Age of the 19th century, as both eras were consumed with glory, and both did not focus on the high rates of poverty and crime that were underlying. For example, the Gilded Age was centered around big business such as Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company and Carnegie's Steel Production Company. The dark side of this era, however, is that these big businesses took advantage of the vulnerable immigrants. They created political machines, the most notable being Tammany Hall. This democratic political organization, run by Boss Tweed, took advantage of the citizens' tax money by using it to pay for the construction of Tammany Hall. The problem was, however, that this organization took too much money from the taxpayers, and Boss Tweed ended up making millions. This is just one example of the corrupt events that occurred during this time period, let alone the corruption of the 1920s.